recording in progress. I'm very excited to see what she's doing, and in uh, our plans to invite her here, sort of realize that she's got this really interesting background. She trained in medicine, and she's really got a very sort of wide background. What I hadn't actually realized, what she did her PhD with a colleague of mine, Sonia Cott. So we have a shared legacy because Sonia actually spent some time at Tufts with my colleague Phil Holcomb.
Mhm.
And then she also has worked in the UK, both at University of Cambridge, um, as well where she's done some really interesting work on animal models for Huntington's, and also with an old colleague of mine, Paul Fletcher, also in Cambridge. And now she's running her own lab and taking really what I think is novel approach. Um, Combining computational modeling with what she's going to be talking today. It sort of links to neurotransmitters like dopamine and glutamate, something very few people are doing. And really excited to hear from her. And I don't think I've ever really sort of heard you give talks, so I'm particularly excited. So without any further ado, sort of welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Gina. That was a very kind introduction. I'm very excited to be here and I'm looking forward to the feedback. I know that a few people in the audience have already heard um, parts of the talk. Yeah, larger parts and smaller parts. Still, I hope it's a nice refresher. So I'll be talking about alterations in predictive language processing in different stages of psychosis. And as Gina pointed out, I will be talking about the effect of the dopaminergic system and glutamatergic system. I want to take um, a little detour to my topic and basically want to show you that some of the most reliable findings that combine the research of prediction error, the research of cognition and behavior with imaging are actually the altered prediction error signal. And here, this is a very recent. Can you see my cursor in the right position? I hope so. Um, Perfect. So here you can see a recent meta-analysis on prediction error processing in schizophrenia. And what has basically been found is that there is a hyperactivity in more cortical areas here seen in the middle frontal gyrus and the postcentral gyrus here for when neutral or non-relevant information is being processed, and then a hypoactivity for more in the mesolimbic system. And this is a study from Graham Murray, from my supervisor in Cambridge, showing exactly those regions and those effects. So if you look here in blue, this is the reward processing in control. So you get a nice strong signal, and you have a reduced signal for neutral stimuli. And you see basically exactly the opposite finding in the patients. We then did a follow-up study across the spectrum of psychosis, and we found very similar effects. So this is a very reliable finding, and it relates to many behavioral traits and also to many symptoms in psychosis. It has been strongly linked to the dopaminergic system. What we don't know when we do these studies, which are mainly reinforcement learning studies, so decision-making studies, is whether those altered prediction error signals actually stem from an altered processing of prior information or of sensory information. And so here, already using this terminology, you can see that I'm framing it within the predictive processing framework. And this framework basically describes how we as humans interact. And here I'm really meaning actively with our world and trying to make sense of these very noisy and ambiguous signals. And you can see that during this interaction, we need to, based on our internal representations, internal models, we need to generate these predictions and combine them with the sensory input that we're receiving or perceiving from the world. And in this processing of a potential mismatch, we have exactly this prediction error that we can either use to update our internal models or that we can also ignore if we think that, for example, the sensory information is not very reliable. And with the following example, I want to show you how very quickly a person can build these representations. So I'm going to present to you some sine wave speech. I'm sure that a lot of people have already heard sine wave speech, so it sounds like this. Could you hear this? I'll play it again. I hope that no one understood what I was playing. So now I will give you some internal model.
She cut with her knife.
And now that I gave you this representation, so saying she cut with her knife, if I now replay the sine wave speech, I hope that you really got the feeling that now you can map this very distorted signal with your internal representation, and suddenly you can make sense of it. And it's always, I mean, especially if you experience it in a more natural setting than a Zoom setting, it is always a quite nice effect that you're seeing here. And so this can basically be displayed in this predictive processing framework. So where our posterior, our percept, is basically generated due to a combination of our prior expectations with the incoming sensory information. Now it has been proposed.
She cut with her knife.
Now it has been proposed that in predictive processing, when we apply it to psychosis, that there is a shift in our representation, and that might either stem due to an overweighting of the prior information, which basically means that our perception, our posterior, moves towards the prior, as shown here in the middle image, or due to a stronger representation of the sensory likelihood. So basically, when we put more emphasis on the incoming signal rather than our expectations, and that is when our posterior shifts towards the sensory likelihood. What has been proposed is that that the shift of the posterior towards the prior has been linked to hallucination detection and potentially due to an alteration in the glutamatergic system. Whereas this over-reliance on sensory information has been associated with altered dopamine processing. Here, mainly going in line with the aberrant salience hypothesis. Of course, this is a very simplified representation, and there is a lot of literature out there that tries to have a more differential approach in terms of symptom development, symptom states, and so on. So this is basically a simplified working model. And of course, quite a few studies are out there that already looked at predictive processing in psychosis, trying to investigate whether it is the prior that is overweighted versus the sensory information. So here are some example studies. A study that I conducted with a colleague in Cambridge, where we looked at a McGurk effect. So that was a multisensory study integrating visual processing and auditory processing. We found differences looking at different early stages of psychosis and basically finding an over-reliance of prior information, especially of cognitive representation, so higher level, which was quite interesting. But the study still had quite a lot of limitations, I would say, in terms of the modeling that we applied and so on. Then this study, most of you will know, it's a seminal study by Al Powers of conditioned hallucinations, basically showing that in a visual oddball paradigm, basically with tone emissions, people build these representations where they perceive a sound even when no sound was presented. And this was interestingly, especially in people suffering from hallucinations, but independent of the clinical status. So also people who are non-clinical voice hearers had this representation of sounds during sound emission. So it was a quite clear signal for kind of a symptom-specific marker. Interestingly, this study has now been used in many different studies. The effects were replicated, and even a few studies showing kind of a longitudinal effect where this particular marker is predictive of symptom development over time. So quite nice in terms of potentially identifying some computational markers for symptom development, for example. But then these first two studies are quite in line with like this over-reliance of priors and hallucinations, for example. This last study is interesting because it finds an overweighting of sensory information that is also linked to, for example, hallucinations and delusions. So it's not specific, and it's in a clinical setting, and it's looking at very intrinsic visual perception. So in a bistable perception task, so where dots are basically rotating on the screen. And here, interestingly, it was found that patients with schizophrenia have an advantage in detecting changes, rotational changes in this task. So the empirical evidence here is quite inconsistent in terms of the overweighting of the prior and the sensory likelihood. And one reason for this might be that all of these studies model or manipulate the sensory information and the priors separately. So often these studies are actually set out to particularly investigating one aspect of the predictive coding framework. And so what we try to do is we basically try to come up with a paradigm and a model that would allow us to simultaneously manipulate and model the prior information and the sensory likelihood. And that is why we moved to language and why we used language. Language, of course, is intrinsically predictive. So we're generating these predictions all the time when trying to follow a conversation, for example. Also, language plays a very big part in the symptomatology of schizophrenia. So it's one of the core symptoms. It relates to positive and negative symptoms. And so it really has a key role there, especially also when you think about, for example, auditory verbal hallucinations. So we came up with this predictive language paradigm, which really set out to mirror that predictive processing framework, which would ultimately allow us to quantify specific parameters in the task. So I will walk you through the task. Please interrupt if you have any questions on the task, because I think for then understanding the results, it's quite essential that you know what we're doing here. And I will always play you some sound stimuli as well. So first what we do is we present a participant with the semantic prior, which is basically the beginning of a sentence. And this semantic prior reflects our prior and our predictive processing framework. We measured the semantic prior with the concept of Shannon's entropy. So here, this is a marker of predictability. We actually, in our model, use entropy as a continuous parameter, but for easier representations, I will later on have it binned in low entropy, high entropy, and so on. Low entropy would basically match with a high predictability. It would be a sentence like this.
The ship disappeared into the thick.
So the ship disappeared into the thick. You can complete this sentence with very few options, so that's why it's low entropy. A sentence like this, on the other hand,
the new laptop was on top of a,
could be completed with a lot of different answers. After presenting this semantic prior, we move on to presenting the sentence final word, which is our sensory evidence. So basically representing our sensory likelihood here. And for this sensory evidence, we basically conducted two manipulations. We first manipulated the sensory noise of that signal by using some noise decoding. So we degraded the word using different numbers of channels. The noisiest word that a person would hear in this paradigm would sound like this. So not very understandable. The next level would be this. Then this. And finally this. So this last word that you heard is the word box. So it was the sentence final word for our unpredictable sentence. And as you can hear, it is still highly noisy. So you really need to rely on your predictions in order to make sense of it. However, this was not the only manipulation that we had for the sensory evidence. We also manipulated the surpriser of the word, so how well the word matched the sentence, which is measured in close probability. And so we had sentences like this.
The knight needed oil for his.
So the knight needed oil for his. Probably you would think of the word armor, but we presented this word. Joints. So it is still semantically correct, but it's less expected. And so this is a nice representation of our sensory likelihood here. Finally, then we simply asked the participants how clearly they perceive this sentence final word, and that's an interesting measure because it gives us the precision of our sensory likelihood, simply because because a word that has been presented with more channels will also be rated as more clearly, independently of the context. However, if you have a very strong prediction, you will perceive this word more clearly, and that is then also a measure of the precision of our prior, so to say. Finally, we then asked participants what they perceived, so we have a one-to-one mapping of our posterior. We also had confidence rating, which correlated really highly with clarity. So we have not included it in our model yet. So now, I want to take a little excursion to briefly tell you how we defined entropy. So what we did here was we defined entropy in a separate sample. So basically, we handed out lists with sentences to about 95 to 100 individuals and asked them for first association completions. So they had to name the first word that would come to their mind. Based on those answers, we then basically calculated channel's entropy based on the frequency of the unique responses and the number of different responses all over. We then also, because we're living in the world of LLMs, so we then also replicated this using not ChatGPT, but GPT and we simulated a diverse cohort and extracted the 20 completions of the 20 highest completions and their probabilities, and then used those to generate Shannon's entropy. As you can see, we find a relatively moderate to strong correlation. It's not super high. We're still working on this. There are still some differences in terms of the tokens that are being specified. So for example, an LLM will basically have a different representation for a token than a real life answer. And of course, a lot of the real life answers are also very much experience driven. So they might just not come up in LLMs. So that's quite interesting. If you now don't want to go through the hassle and recording those entropies in in real people, you can use our Munich sentence database, which we have set up with all of our sentence. So if you want to conduct a study, you can use those. Okay, so back to our paradigm. So now that you basically got an idea of how we set up our paradigm in order to match the predictive processing framework, we basically did not stop there, but used a Bayesian belief updating model to then be able to mechanistically quantify our prior weight. And the prior weight is a very important parameter in this scenario because it allows us to estimate how much a person uses its prior information relative to the sensory information. And you can see here, this is our prior weight. And as you can see, we have informed our prior weight by all of our parameters or the essential parameters in our model. And then you can describe this using a Bayesian regression model. This is important to know because the output that I will show you later will always look like the output of a regression model. So you can read it quite similarly. And then this nu is basically used as the weighting factor for a prediction error. So here, this last term basically describes the difference of the new evidence and our prior information. And we have our weighting factor here. One important aspect about this model is that we can inform it by any kind of other parameter. So we can inform it by, for example, a clinical parameter, or here in this case, a subclinical parameter such as the SPQ. And that will allow us to estimate how much our prior weight will shift either towards the prior or towards the sensory evidence when this particular parameter increases. And we can use not only clinical ones, but we can also include neurobiological markers, like, for example, glutamate levels or dopamine levels, if we have those. So since this was a relatively new paradigm, or it was an entirely new paradigm, and it's actually now, I didn't update this, it's now being published in Biological Psychiatry. We first conducted it in a healthy cohort with schizotypal traits. We had 109 of those. And here are basically the performance levels. So what you can see is that here I bin the entropy in categories, low, medium, and high, and also a category that we call low entropy mismatch. And those are especially those sentences where we altered the close probability of the last word. So we presented a word that was less expected, where we could potentially induce a task-based hallucination. So basically a misperception. And what you can see here is that correct responses seen in the first bar, that they decrease with entropy and surpriser increasing. So if you look here in the low entropy, we're at around 78, 80%. And then in the mismatch, this is going down. And naturally, as you would expect, task-based hallucinations are increasing. So whereas we have very few task-based hallucinations in the low entropy category, we have a lot of task-based hallucinations in high entropy and low entropy mismatch. And that is exactly what we expected. Then for our noise manipulation, what we found there was that higher clarity ratings, as predicted, related to more channels. So you can see that here in the differentiation within one category. And then we also found that the clarity rating decreased overall with entropy and surpriser increasing. And what that means is that you can see here this kind of diagonal trend that becomes especially apparent in these lower channel categories. So if you look at the representation of a 3-channel word in the low entropy condition versus in the high entropy condition. So here you really see the effect of the predictability. Importantly, then we found that our schizotypal traits related to or correlated with mean clarity, basically saying that people higher on the SPQ scale rated clarity generally a little bit higher. And this was also, and the same effect we also found for task-based hallucinations. These results are great, and we were really happy with them. However, they don't give us the answer to our questions. They don't allow us to say whether here we're having an overweighting of sensory information or prior information. For that, we need our modeling results. So I'm showing you the modeling results in that regression output. So the only line that you need to look at is this line where we have the effect of our SPQ onto the prior. The prior, you can read off here on the x-axis. So we have a sensory evidence and the semantic prior. Anything that diverges from the 0 line and does not overlap is considered a significant effect. What this now means is that our prior weight is shifted towards the semantic prior. So it means that if SPQ increases by 1 point on the SPQ scale, which has in our binary scale 74 points, then our prior weight increases by 3.5%, which is a quite drastic increase. When we then simulate that for the general effect of the SPQ and across all the different entropy conditions, what you can see is quite interesting, is namely that if you consider normal or standard language processing in this paradigm, is that you should basically overweight the sensory information, because you always want to check what is happening. So that's why you have generally a shift in the sensory evidence, and only either when you reach very strong levels of SPQ or highly uncertain conditions, then you start overweighting that the prior information very strongly. So that was very interesting to break it down for these different effects. We then replicated our effect of the prior weight in a smaller sample of 55 individuals. And for those, we had, it was actually, so the study was done recording EEG, and we also had a quite intensive imaging protocol. So here we also recorded spectroscopy in the ACC and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, left and right. And we used, again, a regression approach to investigate whether our different levels of cortical glutamate would predict our prior weight that we extracted from our model. And what we found was that indeed there was a relationship between increased levels of ACC glutamate and an increase in the prior weight, giving us a first indication for a neurobiological marker potentially. Since we had for these 55 individuals also electrophysiological data, we looked at the N400 component here, basically only looking at matching and mismatching sentences across the entropy levels. So what you can see here is our trajectory of the electrophysiological response. We then looked at that N400 time window, since this is the standard time window for an N400 semantic prediction error effect. And what you can basically see is that the N400 amplitude decreases with decreasing predictability. So that basically means that you have that the prediction error signal is increasing for unpredictable contexts, which is exactly what you would expect. So you have that nice degradation. And then we basically used a linear mixed model approach to analyze the data and the effect of our trade markers, so schizotypy and also and also autistic traits. And there we found a trait-linked decrease for the prediction error signal, which basically meant that higher levels of schizotypal and autistic traits were associated with a reduced N400 amplitude difference for the predictable versus the unpredictable context. And that is really interesting because it relates very nicely to those prediction error studies that I showed you at the beginning. So it seems to be an effect that is basically generalizable not only to these rewarding contexts, but also to a general context. We then had another question, and this question was how stable these predictions actually are. Because there's always, if you look in the literature, there's always the discussion of whether these predictions that are being formed, whether those are global predictions or local predictions. Other people, they might call them internal and external states. So there's a big discussion about where those predictions and priors are coming from. And so one aspect is always to ask how stable they are over time. So we did a very similar study with our sentences, where we basically just send out loads of sentences and ask for completions, and then send them out again after I think 4 or 5 weeks, and combine them with filler sentences. So we had to get the same number of sentences back. We had to split it up in 2 sessions. And we then again used a general linear model approach to look at the stability. And what we basically found was that higher levels of schizotypal and autistic traits were associated with reduced temporal stability. And that was really interesting because it was particularly for those highly predictable contexts. Basically meaning that situations where we would expect that people would be stable, because if you want to complete a sentence like she liked her coffee with milk, and you kind of expect that sugar would be the appropriate answer now and also in 4 weeks' time. But in especially these contexts, people with increased traits actually showed much more variability. And if we want to link that to our other findings, and then what this could mean is basically that while people with higher schizotypal traits rely more on a momentarily local prior, they might have more reduced priors on a global level. So that's quite interesting. But obviously this needs to be investigated in more detail. Then we had another question, which was basically what happens at the different stages of psychosis. And here you see a normal trajectory, not a normal, but a trajectory of the disease. And we basically predicted that in a psychotic state, so whenever positive symptoms are high, people rely more on the prior. And in a state of psychotic remission, so when the positive symptoms are reduced, this would normalize. And then we would also expect that these trajectories or this change in the prior would be linked to levels of glutamate and dopamine. For that, we had this longitudinal study where we basically investigated patients at 2 time points. Once in this relapse phase, so that all those people were chronic schizophrenia patients, and then again in the state of remission, and you can see that the PANSS symptoms really decrease at the second time point. I think I need to hurry up a little bit, so I will jump right to the modeling results because they're the most interesting. And I will show you again these modeling outcomes. So all the behavioral results were basically replicating our study before. What we now saw at the first time point, so when individuals are in a state of psychosis, here you can see the controls on the left and patients on the right. And since here we're looking at a model that does not include a individualized marker because we don't have a PANSS score for the controls, you need to look at the intercept level. And what we can see in the controls is that there is sensory overweighting. And this is what we expected based on our simulations that I showed you earlier. For the patients, on the other hand, we can see this high overweighting of the prior belief. And now look what happens when people are in remission. And that is very interesting because here we see a very significant shift of the prior weight in the patients. So it seems that it is indeed normalizing to some extent during a state of remission. As I said, we then also collected levels of glutamate, theory-driven or basically results-driven in the ACC. You can see that there are slight differences in the patient group. This is only based on 17 patients, so now we have more data and the difference becomes significant. And if you now look at the effect of glutamate on the prior weight, it is really interesting because if you compare the impact here and compare it to the intercept, you can basically see that the changes in glutamate fully explain the overweighting of the prior on the intercept level. So this is based on the model, a more mechanistic explanation, and that changes in the glutamatergic system also explain the overweighting of the prior information. So that was really fascinating to see that. We then also, oh yeah, I forgot to talk about the remission state. So in the remission state, we can see that there is a slight decrease in the levels of glutamate, and we also see that this is normalizing here in the effect of the glutamate. We then also had PET data for this striatum, basically recording dopamine synthesis capacity in the entire striatum, but also in sub areas. I haven't looked at those. So here, this is now data of the entire striatum. You can see that there is not much difference, neither between the groups nor between the time points. What is really interesting is that dopamine, as you would expect based on the theory, is impacting the model on a sensory evidence level. So an increase in dopamine will lead to an overweighting of sensory information. However, if you look at the effect that including dopamine in our model has on the intercept, it does not explain the overweighting of our prior at the intercept level. There is a slight shift, but not a massive shift. So here we basically see the mechanistic role of dopamine within the predictive processing framework, but within the patient, it doesn't explain the overweighting of the prior. And we see that there is no change in remission, which is what we would have expected. So to have like a summary, or at least a small summary, what I could show you with these different studies was basically that we had this bottom-up approach, or this bottom-up alteration within the predictive processing framework that is associated with delusions. We couldn't show that because I didn't show you any direct symptom correlations or symptom impact within our model, but I could show you that indeed this shift towards the sensory information is potentially linked to the dopaminergic system. So here I could basically present a model that includes dopaminergic information and quite nicely modulated predictive processing framework, where this became mechanistically relevant. And then on the other hand, I could show you that this top-down effect was potentially modulated mechanistically by the glutamatergic system, which is quite interesting. And now to give you another overall summary. So with this work, I basically was able to provide some quantified evidence for the overweighting of the prior. So we saw that shift of the prior weight towards the prior information. And that was the case for people with increased schizotypal traits, but also with patients in an acute psychotic state. And then I was able to show you that increased levels of glutamate increased the prior weight in a schizotypal trait, but especially also in the psychotic state. And again, that was normalized. On the other hand, dopamine functions as a modulator of sensory evidence, but does not explain the overweighting of the prior in our model. And so the next steps are for us to basically continue the data collection, which is still ongoing. It's very long and a bit draining because of all the dropouts. And then to finally do more analyses. So I've compiled a lot of different models, basically combining all different aspects, so time point, group, metabolites, and so on, to have it all in one model. But obviously, I need to wait for the data to be fully collected in order to run them. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you. Do real life clapping. So I have I'll wait for all the clapping to end. So I guess I'll start because I've got a question and a comment. I mean, first of all, it's really impressive what you've been doing, and I really like the paradigm actually. And you've collected, sort of some really beautiful data. But well, it's not a but because I actually don't think it alters your story. Well, but it has important implications for your story, and it doesn't sort of alter some of it, but it's a different way of thinking about it, and that's concerning the ERP data. So don't think you're seeing an N400 there. What you're seeing is a large, long, slow wave late positivity. And that's really, and I know that because that's been described a lot with speech and noise. So what happens is what happens is the system, instead of going into basically retrieve from memory mode, what it does is actually something more analogous to say what the powers people were doing with the oddball. It's like it's a P600 like effect. It's been described by Herman Kalt. We've replicated it and it's really super interesting. So what happens is that you're getting this kind of noisy signal, and then you're reprocessing the input to try and figure out whether or not you heard it before. And then so you're it's still, I think you can, I need to think about it, but I think you can still sort of like interpret it in terms of surprise and likelihood, but it's more of an adaptation effect. And it's happening at a later stage of processing. So if you look at your ERP signal, it's starting at about 300 and it's totally overwhelming and the N400 effect that you're seeing, and it's going way down, it's going positive direction. And so I think those differences aren't differences in sort of semantic facilitation as we normally think about it. It's a difference in how much essentially uncertainty driven attention you're reallocating to the input to try and figure out what that input actually meant. And I need to think about it more because I haven't really thought about it in relation to your data, but I think it's got some really interesting implications that don't negate like the beautiful story that you're telling, but it sort of casts a slightly different light on it. And I'd love to talk to you about that. And I just wondered whether anyone, because it's very prolonged,
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. And I mean, this is also something that now that we are writing this up, that we're also thinking about and have conducted some analysis about. And the interesting thing though is that you can basically, when we group it by our entropy sentences, that you see this explanatory effect. And it's interesting because you can call it uncertainty, and I totally agree. But uncertainty is measured with entropy. I mean,
it doesn't negate the fact that
yeah.
because basically on the P600 you get huge effects of prior predictability. So if you get, like, say, on the semantic P600, and basically it's a long P600 effect, and you get that, and you get that like on for syntactic anomalies, for semantic anomalies, and also in not just normal things in noise, you get an effect of prior predictability, which you're calling entropy. And so it doesn't, I think but I think it's just a functionally a different effect to the actual N400.
Yeah, it would be great to
It would be
talk about
great
that.
to talk to you about that because
Yeah.
and it so happens that I've been thinking about that a lot lately, and it's
Perfect.
really super interesting. I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
I think Lena had a question.
Thank you, Gina. Thank you, Franziska. This was an excellent, beautiful work and really thought-provoking. I was thinking of your conclusion, the coherence that you're bringing with glutamate, with dopamine, and with the overweighting of priors. And, if we take a step back and look at the wider literature of neurochemical imaging in general, I thought there may be few inconsistencies with this. If I understand correctly, if you're saying that the overweighting of priors is present in acute psychosis, in schizotypy, and it's related to higher glutamate. It's possible that that could be an acute episode effect given what you saw in over time, in Remington and over time. In general, the data on periodic higher levels of glutamate in psychosis is pretty sparse or non-existent. And even in early stages of psychosis, we don't really find consistently high glutamate in any brain region. There has been a lot of meta-analysis. I think a lot of meta-analysis more than the actual evidence of papers in this area. So I don't know what's your thought on that. Should we be thinking whether it's a defect of spectroscopy as a method, or I would like to see what you think of pharmacological manipulations of these priors as well on that line.
I think that you're raising a really fair point. I think some of the meta-analyses, actually, especially in schizotypy, they do show some effects in glutamate. But yeah, the question is not the question. The problem with all of these meta-analysis and everything is that there are so many components that need to be taken into account because of voxel placement, voxel size, and so on. So we never really have overlapping data. And apart from that, I mean, here we're looking at a static marker. It just gives us some intuition of the system. I think what we can do is using EEG data and looking into the excitatory and inhibitory balances, maybe combining it with some other paradigms, and even here doing some trial-by-trial analyses that will give us more information about this. I think this is potentially one approach. Another approach would be doing it with some pharmacological interventions potentially and see their effects. But I think this is really just based on hypotheses in the literature, getting some very crude markers. It is interesting, though, that we find it within those two cohorts. Of course, again, maybe there is a bias because of the way we are assessing spectroscopy here, because obviously those patients and healthy individuals were all scanned here in Munich. So yes, maybe there is a local bias. It would be super interesting. And so we're branching out, and the study is going to be run in different places. So let's see whether we still get the same effects. But you're totally right. I think it is. Especially spectroscopy is a bit sketchy.
That's good. I just wanted to add, despite that, overarching challenge, we have data that's very consistent with what you've been showing.
Okay.
So this was published. This is based on Gina and Tori's analysis of contextual sensitivity in untreated psychosis, and we had a 7 Tesla glutamate from ACC in these books. I would say a little bit more sensitive measure of glutamate there. but we still found lower levels of glutamate was related to poor contextual sensitivity, which is similar to, lower levels of glutamate and priors being less weighted in these people.
Yeah,
So there's some
interesting.
consistency there. This is
And
published.
is that published already?
Yeah, this was early this year, actually. Letitia
Okay.
Wang, very sharp, and Gina and me. You can see this in Biological
Cool.
Psychiatry.
I will check it out.
Yeah,
Great.
great.
Amelie?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the great presentation. It just like I have so many questions or like so many thoughts. But one thing I think it's like what that I want to prioritize, and that is a very naive question, because this is like very like at the more like sensory level, and but like a lot of like similar processes you have like at like higher order levels, but like so I'm thinking about like like in like social cognition or like evidence integration and like so like more like not at a perceptual but more as like a reasoning kind of level, so like evidence and integration or like integration of disconfirmatory evidence or like like the bias against disconfirmatory evidence. And I was just wondering, like, is it the same people who are affected by both? Like, do we know anything about like so the relationship between like the very like more like perceptual level versus like the more like complex like cognitive judgment like level
Within,
of the
you mean within the psychosis spectrum and within the different symptomatology?
and like more like in general, like so like how can I use that to like think about like other like things that I'm interested about that are like a little bit more higher up? Like does it relate? Like
so I guess I have probably like two comments to that. So it's interesting that you describe this this semantic processing study as like more sensories, because I would like when you build a semantic prediction, I would argue it's already quite it's on the cognitive level. But of course, I totally see your point. So of course, social cognition or reasoning is a more complex, but probably a system relying on these semantic processes and these semantic predictions. So the question is, how much more noise do you integrate when you go even higher? Or you need to control for so many more things, I guess. Are the same people affected on both of these or in both of these areas? I'm pretty sure there would be. I don't know of any studies that combine semantic processing and social cognition, but I think it's a generally something that needs to be done much more broadly. So basically, within the same people conducting very different experiments that cover very different hierarchical levels. And I think only then you will be able to relate those changes that you see within these different paradigms to specific symptoms. But I think it requires that we combine paradigms in the same people, which is difficult because, of course, those patients, they can only do a certain amount of things, and then you have it on different days, and there's so many confounders. But ideally, if you can, I think combining studies that cover the processing hierarchy would always be needed, I guess.
Because so much of it like seems like so relevant, like also. Well, thank you.
Has anyone else? I just suddenly thought of something else when Lena and you were talking. Sorry, I'm obsessed with this. I mean, you basically saw a P6 a long P600 effect, and that would also fit with the anterior cingulate data actually, because I don't think it's a direct source, although it may be, but it would contribute to what I think you're seeing, which is the kind of very rapid adaptation to the noise within the input that is basically weighting how much you're reprocessing the noise versus, sorry, the input versus the prior. But I need to think that more through. I can't wait to sort of look at your data again with Oh, someone's coming in. With that, yeah, let's be in touch offline. I need to reread your papers with that kind of view in mind. But it's super interesting, and it would definitely fit with this anterior cingulate stuff more than interpreting it as something like the N400, which we know that's got a very kind of lateral temporal or inferior temporal source. And actually, it also would fit with the variability that you're seeing across sessions too, because that's the kind of longer term thing, which more related to adaptation. Sorry, I'm thinking on the fly, but I'm really excited about it.
No worries. Thank you. Hi, Philip again.
Hi, Franziska. Brilliant talk. Thanks so much again. One question I'm also meant to ask you in Berlin already. It was about the longitudinal data that we showed.
Yeah.
What is your intuition about the high entropy condition decrease that you showed us in the prior, if I recall correctly? Why would this happen? That people that get more stable in the most predictable condition while improving, as you showed, I think.
Is this what you mean? The overweighting?
No, I think you showed some correlation. It was on some slides before that.
For the SPQ and ASQ data.
Yeah, exactly, that one.
Oh, wait. This data here.
Yeah, no. There was something where you said that.
Oh,
no, it's not this one. It was a long, very, very narrow correlation band of several conditions in entropy. No, not this one.
I think I lost you for a moment, but so can you repeat? Because I was
I thought I understood that when people repeat this sentence completion. Yeah, yes, this one.
Yeah.
This one. And you said that in the most predictable condition, in the low entropy condition.
So basically what happens here is that when we ask people to fill in a sentence again that they had seen before, they were more variable in their responses. So they often detected that they had heard or had seen the sentence before, and they were often also sure that they had given the same response, and still when we checked, the responses were different. So we see basically more variability in these high predictable conditions. And one of our arguments would be that what we're seeing here is reduced general priors, so less specificity in general priors. But so it doesn't go, so it does not necessarily go against our finding of the other studies where we see this higher reliance on a prior, because that is always a local prior. So here, obviously, ideally, we would have a reassessment of those, or a combination of those studies, and basically show our sentences again, and also ask whether they recognize the sentences and so on. But yeah, so your question being why this would happen?
Yeah.
So one argument would be the effect of general volatility. So what we see in other areas of decision making and so on is that people with schizophrenia and also schizotypal traits have much or experience much more environmental volatility, and that would fit quite well. So here showing that the environment is volatile, and so are my general responses as well.
Okay, and this, just to be clear, this was in healthy participants.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Exactly.
Great. Thanks so much.
This is just, and what is interesting here is that we basically find an effect, the same effect in schizotypy and also in when we're looking at autistic traits,
right?
Which is quite interesting. Yeah, Gina.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's something really interesting going on, and this is where like the problem with prior likelihood, because there's basically, yeah, there's the local prior for, the sentence context itself, which is coming from some higher level, but presumably is being propagated down to a lower level. So it's like a top-down predictive prior. But you've also got these two other things. You've got also, whenever you're like looking at the relationship between a prior and likelihood, the likelihood itself is subdivided, and you can put parameters over that. So you've got basically the your trust in the sensory input. You've got the actual noise in the sensory input, like basically literally the discriminability, literally the noise and how much you trust it, but also how much you trust your own process. And all of those can marginalize out into something that looks like effective likelihood, but they can each have priors over that. And and then you've also got this other thing, which is basically your beliefs about the volatility of the environment. And that can play out in really weird ways, as you know, with kind of suddenly your priors have really, strong value and suddenly weak. And it literally can kind of flip around things. And so I wondered whether maybe a next step in your model, it would, yeah, I mean, people presumably know that there's noise. So I think you can kind of definitely trust that as a kind of knowledge, but you can, yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to think of one way of dissociating these different types of information that can,
Yeah.
especially
So
Philip's
what we're
comments
now
about the whole volatility thing is going to completely mess with that story because suddenly, if you believe that your environment is super volatile, then suddenly you're not going to trust your priors nearly as much, what you called your local priors nearly as much. And then suddenly that whole, you know,
yeah.
balance that you talked about breaks down.
So one approach that we're now taking to get into answering that question or coming close. I don't think it will provide a full answer, but it definitely will provide some parts of the answer. So we've now set up an experiment where it basically looks exactly like the one that we've set up, but we also asked after asking what they heard, we also asked what their expectation was for that sentence, for that word, to basically see whether they expected something different from what they presented. It might be that this messes up the entire experiment a little bit. If not, which would be great, which we're hoping, because we're still advising them to really tell us what they heard and not what they expected. But we will see over time how much those answers that they expected differ from the ones that they have given. And if we then were to repeat this experiment over time, we could basically assess exactly that. We could also factor in how stable they were over time. And we could see whether there is a differentiation between whether this increased volatility would reflect in them always having very different expectations from what we presented to them. So maybe that is one way of moving towards answering some of these questions.
Super interesting. Thank you. Does anyone have more questions?
Gina, I have an
I
announcement.
know that Lena has an announcement. So I'll let Lena do his announcement and then we'll wrap up and thank Franziska.
Great. Thank you, Franziska. Thanks a lot again. Just want to announce before everybody disperses the next consortium meeting. Valentina is here. She can fill you in with more details. Valentina.
Yeah, thank you, Lena. And I'm very happy to present, let's say, a preliminary program of the annual Discourse meeting, which this year will be combined with a training event that we can organize thanks to some European money. Of course, all this event will be in Pavia, and the first day will be based on different talks and presentation by the different working groups of Discourse. And the second day will host these training meetings that I mentioned. Many of you are involved in these training events. Gina, for instance, who's teaching one of these. The organization is, say, with me. The help comes from Chiara Barattieri di San Pietro and Federico Frau, who are also here. And we have a very preliminary website, which I will put in the chat. Let me write this in the chat.
Done it, Valentina. It's on the chat, don't worry.
You put it, yeah, okay, then, yeah. So there's a preliminary program where you can see the variety of topics that are, I would say, align with the seminar of today, because there's some brain activity analysis with different approaches, oscillation, sensory integration, etc. But there is also computational approaches, machine learning. So there's a variety of topics. There will be also some travel grants. These will be announced soon. And there will be also a call for posters. So there will be some slot for poster presentation during the first day. I think that the Discourse newsletter contain a link for a preliminary manifestation of interest to participate. And please follow up that link and manifest your interest. There will be a proper registration form at a later stage. Because, of course, seats are limited. There are a lot of seats, but they're limited. So, yeah, I look forward to seeing you all.
Thank you, Valentina. That's it for us, Gina. You can take over back again. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I'm so excited to see you all. And so, yeah, I just wanted to thank Franziska again for a really, really, beautiful programmatic talk. And it's always a sign of a really good talk for me when I come up through really thinking about things. And I'm going to reread your stuff, and it would be great to be in touch. That's from me personally, but I'm sure you've inspired many of us here. And thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me. It's great. And thanks for the feedback.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Franziska. Nice.
Bye. Thanks.